It was just past 2:14 a.m. when the emergency hotline received a call from a trembling neighbor, her voice thin, shaky, almost fading under the weight of the silence behind her. She insisted she heard a loud crash coming from the Harrington residence, followed by an eerie stillness. "Something's wrong," she whispered, "I can feel it." By the time responding officers reached the old house at the edge of the cul-de-sac, fog had already begun to snake across the lawn, curling around the porch as though the night itself was hiding something. The door was unlocked. The air inside felt stale, motionless, like a room sealed shut for far too long. The victim, Daniel Harrington, the last surviving member of a family already whispered about in old crime forums and half-forgotten newspaper clippings, lay motionless at the foot of the staircase. His expression was strangely peaceful, almost resigned, as if he had known this night was coming. No signs of forced entry. No struggle. No obvious wounds. Just the body of a 38-year-old man who, hours earlier, had been seen alive, walking his dog, smiling politely at neighbors, completely unaware that he would become the final chapter in a story stretching back more than a century. At first, the officers treated it as a standard unattended death. But that was before they noticed something odd, a small wooden carving, no larger than a thumb, placed near his hand. It looked worn, ancient, carved with symbols that didn't belong to any modern craft. This was the same object found at the deaths of his father, his grandfather, and even his great-grandmother. A coincidence? The senior detective didn't think so. He had reviewed the family file before responding to the call, a file unofficially labeled, "The Harrington Curse." As investigators spread through the house, the sense of déjà vu grew stronger. The placement of the body, the serene expression, even the faint smell of burnt wax lingering in the air, it all mirrored scenes from the previous generations. Like a ritual being repeated over and over with unnerving precision. One officer whispered what everyone else was thinking but refused to say out loud, "It's happening again." Daniel's phone lay on the kitchen counter, battery dead, screen cracked. But the cracked screen wasn't what drew attention. It was the last message he had tried to type, "It's here." Unsent, unfinished, and terrifying. Outside, reporters began assembling as word spread. The Harrington story always drew attention. Every generation, someone died under bizarre circumstances, drownings without water, fires without ignition sources, accidents without logical explanations. The family's tragedies had become the kind of whispers exchanged at campfires, buried deep in Reddit threads, and dissected on paranormal podcasts. And now, with Daniel's death, the curse, which many had dismissed as superstition, returned to the spotlight. Detectives, however, were not looking for ghosts. They were looking for patterns, motives, and the one question that every officer dreaded confronting, was someone killing the Harringtons, or was something killing them? The coroner arrived and knelt by Daniel's body. His brow furrowed. There were no signs of cardiac arrest, no head trauma from the fall. Not even defensive marks. It was as if life had simply left his body without explanation. When the coroner gently lifted Daniel's hand, something slipped out from his clenched fingers, a thin, brittle sheet of paper. Handwritten. Old. Too old for Daniel to have written it himself. Only 5 words were legible, "It always comes at night." The room fell silent. Those words had appeared before, in 1964, scrawled on a bathroom mirror hours before Daniel's grandfather died. The same words were found carved into a tree after the disappearance of Daniel's great-uncle in 1931. Now they were back. But before the detectives could fully process this chilling connection, the forensic photographer called them upstairs. On Daniel's bedroom wall, faint but visible under UV light, was a symbol matching the one carved on the wooden figurine. But the real horror wasn't the symbol itself, it was that it appeared to have been drawn that very night. And Daniel had been home alone. The lead investigator stepped back, swallowing hard. If someone had been in the house with Daniel, the breaking point of the curse lore had just shifted. For generations of unexplained deaths now shared more than a tragic coincidence, they shared a signature. As officers sealed the crime scene and the coroner prepared to move the body, one detective looked back at the staircase where Daniel had been found. He didn't believe in curses, but even he couldn't deny the suffocating heaviness in the house, as if the walls held memories too old and too painful to let go. And then he saw it, near the banister. A faint footprint. Small. Bare. Not matching Daniel's size. Not matching any officer's. It pointed toward the second floor, and ended abruptly, as if the owner had vanished into thin air. Before anyone could make sense of the footprint, the rookie officer radioed in, voice shaking, "Detective, you need to see the backyard. There's another carving out here. Fresh." The curse hadn't just returned, it was moving. Morning light had barely touched the outskirts of the small town when the local police chief unlocked a dusty metal cabinet that hadn't been opened in nearly a decade. Inside were 4 thick case files, each labeled with the same family name, Harrington. Daniel's was only the most recent addition. The story stretched back more than 100 years, its roots coiling around 4 generations of tragedy that no detective had ever been able to fully explain. To understand Daniel's death, investigators had to start at the beginning. The great-grandmother, Eleanor Harrington, 1912, Eleanor's photograph was the first to slide across the desk. A soft-faced woman in a high-collared dress stared into the camera, eyes haunted despite her gentle smile. She had been only 29 when she died, found sitting upright in her rocking chair as though she had simply drifted off to sleep. Her hands rested neatly on her lap, her posture calm, too calm. But the report under the photo painted a different picture. Neighbors had heard her scream the night before. No cause of death was ever found. No struggle, no forced entry, no toxins. Just one detail stood out, a wooden carving placed beside her chair, with markings no historian had ever successfully identified. Her death had been dismissed as a medical mystery, a tragic loss of a young mother. But that was before her son died the same way, decades later. The grandfather, Michael Harrington, 1964, Michael was only 42 when he died. A hard-working mechanic, a father of 3, a man with no known health issues, yet one morning his teenage daughter found him in the living room, seated at the coffee table, head lowered as though he had fallen asleep mid-thought. His coffee was still warm. The TV hummed softly. Nothing in the room was disturbed. But the coroner's notes chilled investigators even today. Michael's pupils were dilated. His expression was one of pure terror, frozen in place. His fingernails were cracked from gripping the table so tightly. And then there was the object, placed carefully beside him, the same wooden figurine that had been found beside Eleanor, though more worn now, as if handled repeatedly over the decades. Michael had reportedly complained of voices in the walls, in the weeks leading up to his death. His journals, later discovered in the attic, were filled with restless drawings of spirals, symbols, and a shadowy figure with no face. Doctors labeled it stress-induced psychosis. His family blamed the curse. The police blamed coincidence. But coincidence didn't explain what happened next. The father, Robert Harrington, 1997, Robert's death hit the town harder than any before. He had been a respected schoolteacher, a calm, thoughtful man loved by his students. Unlike Michael and Eleanor, Robert didn't die quietly in a chair. He died on the old lakeside dock, his body floating face up in knee-deep water, even though he was an excellent swimmer. Autopsy reports were baffling, his lungs were not full of lake water, meaning he hadn't drowned. His heart showed no sign of cardiac arrest. There were no injuries. But something was found clutched in his fist. For the first time in nearly 40 years, the wooden carving resurfaced, this time stained with lake mud. Robert's wife told detectives he had nightmares for months, dreams where he saw his grandmother and father standing at the foot of his bed, whispering the same phrase, "It always comes at night." He claimed something followed him home from the lake the week before he died. Something he couldn't see, but felt. Something cold, watching, waiting. The police considered mental health issues. Robert's family insisted the curse had returned. But the most chilling detail wasn't in the autopsy or the police report. It was in Robert's diary. His final entry read, "It's closer now. I can hear it breathing." The final generation, Daniel Harrington, present day, Daniel had grown up hearing bits and pieces of the family history, though most relatives refused to talk about the deaths openly. He was told it was superstition, paranoia left behind by ancestors who didn't understand medical science. But Daniel wasn't convinced. He researched Eleanor's death, then Michael's, then his father Robert's. He built a pattern chart, kept screenshots of autopsy reports, and even tried locating the old wooden figurine, believing it held the key to everything. Friends later told investigators that Daniel had become deeply obsessive in the months leading to his death. He heard tapping noises at night. He saw shadows beneath door frames even when lights were off. He complained about waking with icy fingers gripping his wrists. He told one coworker, "It doesn't want to finish the curse. It wants to continue it." The more he studied the deaths, the more he became convinced that someone, was orchestrating these tragedies across generations. But how? And why the Harringtons? Daniel believed he was close to the truth the week before he died. He had requested old municipal records, contacted a genealogist, and even hired a private investigator. The detective sorting through Daniel's belongings would later say, he knew he was being hunted. He just didn't know what was hunting him. The repeating pattern as the lead investigator reviewed all 4 cases side by side, something became impossible to ignore: each victim was alone when they died. Each death happened at night. Each body was found in an eerily peaceful position, except Robert. Each scene contained the same figurine. And every generation recorded the same phrase, "It always comes at night." For generations. One identical shadow. A pattern that defied logic, and yet was undeniable. But the genealogist brought forward one more disturbing detail: every Harrington who died mysteriously shared the same birth month, and the same death week. That could no longer be ignored. Section 2 cliffhanger: before investigators could analyze the genealogical charts further, the genealogist pulled out a final sheet. "Daniel wasn't the last Harrington," she whispered. "He wasn't even close." And she slid forward a list of other descendants, people who were still alive, and already showing signs of the same pattern. The genealogist placed a single, weathered photograph on the table. One look was enough to understand why the Harrington story didn't begin with Eleanor or Michael or even young Daniel. It began much earlier, with a man everyone in town had chosen to forget. His name was Thomas Harrington, the founder of the bloodline and the first person said to be touched by the curse. The official records listed him as a prosperous farmer, a respected landowner, and a veteran of the early 1900s. But the documents tucked deeper in the archives told a darker version of his life, a version deliberately hidden for more than a century. The story began in the winter of 1911, when Thomas returned home from a business trip 2 days earlier than expected. Snow blanketed the fields. The wind howled through broken barn slats. And the warm glow of lantern light leaked from the windows of the house he shared with his young wife, Eleanor, the same Eleanor whose peaceful yet inexplicable death would decades later become the first official mark of the Harrington curse. But the night Thomas returned, the house was not peaceful. Sheriff's reports described it as a scene of emotional calamity, though the real details were never released to the public. The truth, unsealed only now, shows that the founding tragedy was not a supernatural occurrence but a human one. One filled with betrayal, rage, and something close to madness. When Thomas entered the house that night, he heard voices. Not arguments, but soft, hushed whispers, too intimate to belong to strangers. He followed the sound to the parlor room, where he found Eleanor standing with a man whose identity remained a mystery. The two stood too close. Their faces too conflicted. Thomas stepped forward, demanded an explanation, and received none. The man fled through the back door before anyone could identify him. Eleanor collapsed into tears. Most men in 1911 would have reacted with fury, perhaps violence. But Thomas did something that alarmed even the sheriff who later took his statement. He said nothing. He simply turned away, walked upstairs, and sat down at his desk. Hours passed in silence, during which Eleanor reportedly knocked on the study door over and over, begging him to speak. He never answered. At dawn, he emerged with a single sheet of paper, his handwriting tight, sharp, and unsettlingly calm. Witnesses at the time believed he had suffered a mental break. His farmhands whispered about the way his eyes looked hollow, as if something inside him had died. Townsfolk said Thomas stopped sleeping. Others claimed he began wandering the fields at night, barefoot, muttering phrases that made no sense. And yet none of these rumors ever made it into the official record, because Thomas Harrington was a man the town depended on economically. His reputation was protected, even as his sanity unraveled like an old rope. The real horror began weeks later, when Eleanor reported strange occurrences around the house. Objects moved from place to place without explanation. Footsteps echoed in rooms no one occupied. Doors creaked open at night with no wind to push them. Eleanor believed Thomas was behind it, punishing her, haunting her, trying to break her. But when she confronted him, he denied everything with an eerie calm. Then came the night she awoke to find Thomas standing at the foot of their bed, a candle in his hand, staring at her with an expression neither angry nor sad, just empty. She asked what he was doing. He whispered only, "It begins tonight." The next morning, Thomas vanished. No note. No explanation. His footprints ended at the edge of the woods behind the farm. Search parties combed the fields for days but found nothing except a wooden carving lying in the snow, one that matched the very same object later found beside Eleanor, Michael, Robert, and now Daniel. It was crudely made, carved by hand, with sharp angles and strange markings that resembled no language authorities had ever catalogued. Locals believed Thomas had carved it during his sleepless nights, perhaps as a warning, perhaps as a threat. Eleanor believed it was a message. But she would never get the chance to interpret it. 3 days after Thomas disappeared, Eleanor was found sitting in her rocking chair, dead without cause. The sheriff who examined the body wrote in his sealed notes that her posture suggested zero struggle, almost a surrender, as though she had accepted something inevitable. The carving was placed beside her, just as it appeared with later generations. Town gossip quickly labeled it a curse. The police called it coincidence. The family called it tragedy. But the genealogist reviewing the case saw something else: intentional secrecy. The sheriff's handwritten comments, now unsealed, revealed that townsfolk believed Thomas had returned in the nights following his disappearance. People claimed they saw a figure shaped like him, wandering near the farmhouse, though he never approached and never spoke. Some insisted he left footprints in the barn. One witness swore she heard him calling Eleanor's name at midnight. All sightings stopped the moment Eleanor died. But the most disturbing detail wasn't in the witness testimonies. It was found inside a sealed court record, hidden for more than a century. The document was a confession of sorts, a note Thomas had written the night after discovering Eleanor with the unknown man. In it, he wrote about betrayal, humiliation, and the unbearable collapse of everything he believed in. But then the tone shifted. The handwriting changed, wilder, rushed, almost manic. He wrote, "When trust is broken, blood remembers. When the heart shatters, the shadow awakens. I have invoked something, knowingly or not. It will not rest. Not in my time, nor in theirs." The investigators stared at the letter, unsure what the shadow referred to. Some believed Thomas was referring to another man, perhaps a stalker or rival. Others thought he meant his own inner darkness. But one detail made everyone pause: the last line, scrawled in a different ink, possibly added later, read, "It always comes at night." The same phrase echoed across every generation. But the real shock came when the genealogist flipped the letter over. On the back was a hastily drawn symbol, circular, jagged, identical to the one found in Daniel's bedroom under UV light. This single contradiction, one that shattered the family legend, was this: Thomas Harrington didn't create the curse. He discovered it. And whatever he discovered, had already been watching the family for years. The story of the first official Harrington death, the one investigators refer to as the man who drowned twice, begins on a stormy spring night in 1931. The skies had been boiling since sunset, thunder rolling across the valley in long, vibrating waves that rattled windowpanes and shook lantern flames. In the small lakeside community where the Harrington family lived, bad weather meant retreating indoors, huddling near fireplaces, and waiting for the storm to pass. But Andrew Harrington, Eleanor's only son and Michael's father, did not come home that night. He had gone fishing earlier in the evening, as he often did, to clear his mind. Andrew was known as a kind, steady man, quiet but gentle, described by neighbors as someone born with too much sadness in his eyes. Losing his mother under such mysterious circumstances had left a mark on him, one that deepened over the years into a kind of lingering melancholy. Still, he was a devoted father to young Michael, and fishing by the lake was his way of finding a moment of calm in a life that seemed cursed long before the word was ever whispered. When Andrew didn't return by midnight, his wife grew anxious. By 2 a.m., she woke the neighbors. At dawn, searchers found Andrew's overturned fishing boat drifting near the reeds on the west side of Harrington Lake. His raincoat was tangled in the oars. His boots were caught in the rope. And floating near the shallow edge, just 3 feet deep, was Andrew's lifeless body. The initial assumption was drowning. His skin was pale, his clothes soaked, and his hair plastered against his forehead. But something felt off. The water where he was found was too shallow, barely reaching a man's waist. The lake bed was soft and flat, with no sudden drop-offs or hidden currents. Andrew was a strong swimmer, raised near water his entire life. Locals whispered that drowning didn't make sense, not in that part of the lake, not with Andrew. The sheriff brought Dr. Caldwell, the town's only coroner, to examine the body. Caldwell's notes, handwritten in uneven strokes, tell the story that would haunt investigators for generations. Andrew's lungs were not filled with lake water. There was moisture, yes, but not the volume expected from drowning. Instead, his lungs were filled with a different kind of fluid, thin, clear, and oddly cold. Caldwell wrote, not consistent with lake submersion. Possible aspiration of unknown liquid. Word spread quickly. People talked about Eleanor's unexplained death decades earlier. Some believed the curse had moved to her son. Others insisted something in the lake was responsible. But the most disturbing detail didn't emerge until much later that day. Just after the body was taken to the morgue, a young boy came running into town shouting that a man was lying on the empty road leading to the Harrington farm. The sheriff and a deputy rushed over, and froze when they saw it. The body was Andrew Harrington. Again. His body, cold, lifeless, and unmistakably the same, was lying only a mile from where he had been found earlier. There were no footprints, tire marks, or drag trails leading to the spot. It was as if he had simply appeared there. 2 locations. 2 identical bodies. 1 impossible timeline. To this day, the records simply state, body recovered twice. First location, lake. Second location, roadside. The coroner re-examined the second body and noted something chilling: the lungs were completely dry, contradicting the earlier findings. There was no trace of the strange clear fluid. Instead, Andrew's body temperature suggested he had died only an hour before he was found on the road. But that made no sense. He had already been declared dead hours earlier. Locals speculated wildly. Some said the lake had spat him out, rejecting him. Others said his spirit was wandering, confused, trying to return home. A few whispered that whatever killed Eleanor had now claimed her son, and was not done yet. The sheriff, disturbed by the inconsistencies, questioned everyone who had been near the lake the night before. Most people had been indoors due to the storm. But one name came up repeatedly: Harriet Collins, an elderly woman who lived in a small cabin near the East Woods. She had been seen walking toward the lake at dusk, muttering to herself. Harriet was known for her strange habits, collecting stones and herbs, carving symbols into tree trunks, and warning children not to go near the lake during the restless months. When questioned, Harriet told the sheriff something he initially dismissed as rambling nonsense. She said she saw Andrew on the water that night, but not alone. She claimed a dark figure stood near the boat, tall and unmoving, almost fused with the storm. She said lightning illuminated its shape, and Andrew seemed to be speaking to it. But when she blinked, the figure vanished. Harriet insisted she wasn't imagining things. She swore Andrew had stepped out of the boat willingly, walking into the lake as though being guided. And then she whispered something that made the sheriff's blood run cold: he didn't drown. He followed it. What it was, she could not explain, or refuse to. Harriet said the Harrington family carried a shadow older than the town itself, something passed down not by choice but by blood. She claimed Eleanor had been its first victim. Andrew was simply next. Harriet died years later, but her statements remained in the file, dismissed as superstition, yet echoing eerily through every generation. The wooden carving also reappeared for the first time since Eleanor's death. It was found in Andrew's pocket, wet but undamaged, the carved symbols more pronounced than before, as though time or water couldn't wear them away. The sheriff couldn't explain how the carving got there or why Andrew carried it with him on the night he died. But Harriet had an answer for that too. She told the sheriff, "It finds them. They don't find it." Despite all the strange details, the official ruling remained accidental drowning, though no one truly believed it. Even the sheriff privately confided in his journal that Andrew's death felt orchestrated, like something rehearsed across generations. Michael was only 8 when his father died. Witnesses recalled seeing the boy at the funeral, holding his mother's hand tightly, saying nothing, staring at the lake with wide, terrified eyes. He later told a childhood friend that he saw someone standing on the water's edge during the burial, a tall, dark figure watching the family, unmoving even as the storm wind whipped around it. That friend never forgot Michael's words: it wasn't a person. It was waiting. Andrew's death left more questions than answers, but one detail united everyone who reviewed the case: the sense that his death wasn't the beginning of the curse, it was simply the first documented moment when the curse revealed itself openly. And the most haunting part? The footprint found in Daniel's house decades later, small, bare, vanishing halfway up the stairs, matched the size and shape of the mysterious prints photographed near the lake the night Andrew died. It meant only one thing: whatever was present in 1931, was present now. For years after Andrew's impossible death, the Harrington name carried a weight no one wanted to speak about openly. Michael Harrington grew into adulthood with a quiet determination, almost a defiance, to distance himself from the shadows that had haunted his family for decades. He believed that the tragedies were tied to the land, to the lake, to the old house where his grandmother had died without struggle and where his father had returned from the dead a second time. He wanted nothing to do with any of it. In 1952, at just 22, Michael made a choice that would shape the second generation's fate. He packed a suitcase, left a letter for his grieving mother, and boarded a bus headed thousands of miles away. He promised himself he would never return. He found work as a mechanic in a small industrial town on the West Coast, married a woman named Lillian, and built a new life. He never spoke about the lake, the carving, the strange whisperings that haunted his childhood. To everyone around him, he seemed normal, quiet, hard-working, devoted. To himself, he was a man running from a story he refused to believe was real. But curses do not honor distance. For a decade, Michael remained untouched by misfortune. He believed he had succeeded where his father and grandmother had failed. He refused contact with distant cousins, ignored letters from home, and burned the few belongings he had brought from the old farmhouse. He thought silence was safety. Then, on a warm August night in 1963, everything changed. It began with a fire. Michael and Lillian had been asleep when the smell of smoke drifted through their bedroom window. A neighbor banged on the door, shouting that flames were climbing the side of their house. Michael grabbed his wife and pulled her outside just as the fire swallowed the living room. Firefighters later determined the cause was unknown. No wiring issues. No accelerants. No lightning. The blaze appeared to have started from the inside, specifically, from a drawer where Michael kept a few old photographs from his childhood. The next morning, as he sifted through the ash, Michael found something that should not have survived the fire at all. A small wooden carving, charred at the edges but unmistakably intact, lay in the center of what used to be his drawer. The same carving that had been found beside Eleanor. The same carving found in Andrew's pocket. Michael froze. He and Lillian stared at the object for a long time before she whispered, "Where did that come from? Did you bring this with you?" But Michael shook his head slowly. "I threw it away," he muttered. "Years ago." The fire was only the beginning. Within months, little events began to unfold around the Harrington household, harmless at first, then gradually unsettling. Doors opened by themselves. Lights flickered even with new wiring. Their dog refused to enter the hallway at night, growling at something they could not see. Michael dismissed it all at first. Stress, he told himself. Trauma from the fire. The brain seeing patterns it wanted to see. But the dreams were harder to ignore. Every night, Michael saw a dark figure standing by the edge of the lake he had tried to forget. Sometimes the figure was alone. Sometimes he saw two others behind it, shapes resembling his father and grandmother. They never spoke, never moved, just stared at him until he woke up drenched in sweat. Every dream ended the same way, with a whisper he couldn't place, yet recognized from childhood terror. "It always comes at night." He began sleepwalking. He would wake up on the porch, barefoot, staring into the distance as if waiting for someone. Lillian found him one night standing on top of their dining table, eyes open but unseeing, muttering something about the water calling him back. Another night he tried to leave the house entirely, determined to walk to the nearest river. When Lillian restrained him, he cried, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. He confessed everything he had buried, Eleanor's unnatural death, Andrew being found twice, the carvings, the whispers, the drownings that weren't drownings. Lillian didn't know what to believe. She loved her husband, but the story sounded too monstrous to be real. Still, she agreed they needed to do something. They decided to move again, far from their burnt home, far from the carving, far from anything that reminded Michael of the past. Maybe fresh air, new surroundings, new routines would break the pattern. But patterns do not break. They follow. In 1964, shortly after their move, Michael's mental state worsened. He became paranoid, convinced something watched them from the shadows of their new house. He refused to sleep unless every light was on. He stopped going to work. He stopped speaking to neighbors. Lillian tried to help him regain stability, but every small noise sent him spiraling. The tapping on the windows at night. The creak of the stairs. The faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the walls. Then one afternoon, Lillian returned home and found him sitting completely still in the middle of the living room, staring at the wall. She thought he was asleep, but when she touched his shoulder, he didn't respond. The coffee on the table beside him was warm, suggesting he had been alive minutes earlier. But his pulse was gone. Michael Harrington had died sitting up, exactly how his grandmother had been found decades earlier. The police ruled it sudden heart failure. The coroner's notes, however, suggested otherwise. Michael's fingernails were cracked, gripping the table so tightly they bent. His pupils were blown wide, frozen in raw terror. And on the carpet near his hand lay the wooden carving, restored to its original form, untouched by fire, smooth as polished bone. Neighbors reported something strange that day. 3 individuals were seen walking away from the Harrington house, a tall figure leading 2 smaller ones. But none had clear faces, and none left footprints in the dirt. After Michael's death, Lillian found one final piece of evidence that shattered any hope of coincidence. Hidden in his toolbox was a journal filled with frantic entries, sketches of the same faceless figure, and notes describing voices that seemed to echo through the walls. The final page read, "We moved to escape it. But it doesn't follow the house. It follows the blood." Years later, their only son, Robert, would discover the journal and realize that his father had not gone mad. He had simply realized the truth too late. And when Robert grew up and tried to escape in his own way, the curse would find him too. Distance had not saved the Harringtons. Fire had not erased the past. Silence had not protected Michael. The curse had followed him across the country with patience. And now, the next generation waited unknowingly for its turn. By the time Daniel Harrington's lifeless body was found at the foot of his staircase, law enforcement had no choice but to face a reality they had avoided for decades: the Harrington family was not suffering from random misfortune. Something was repeating across generations, something that defied both logic and statistical possibility. For the first time in more than a century, a specialized investigative team was assembled, combining homicide detectives, forensic analysts, behavioral psychologists, and a genealogist who had already uncovered more than the police wanted to know. The case files for Eleanor, Andrew, Michael, and Robert were laid out side by side in a dim, silent conference room. No one spoke at first. The documents, yellowed and brittle at the edges, seemed to hum with the weight of the past. It was as if opening them together awakened something that had been waiting to be acknowledged. Detective Marcus Hale, the lead investigator, was not a man prone to superstition. He believed in evidence, timelines, and motives. But as he flipped through the reports, even he felt an uneasy tightness in his chest. The deaths didn't align with any familiar pattern, not with serial homicide, not with family violence, not with environmental hazards. Instead, they aligned with each other in ways that made no rational sense. Eleanor died seated upright, calm, hands folded. Michael died nearly the same way, more than 50 years later. Andrew drowned in shallow water, then appeared again on a roadside. Robert drowned without drowning. Daniel died without injury, fear frozen into his face. Different eras. Different circumstances. Same chilling impossibility. But it wasn't just the deaths, it was the objects. Every case included the same wooden carving, its carvings growing sharper instead of fading with age. Forensics tested it for fingerprints, DNA, age estimates, chemical composition, anything that might offer a clue. The results only deepened the mystery. The wood was old, older than any carving found in the region, yet the outer layers appeared recently shaped. There were no fingerprints. No trace elements. No tool marks. It was as if the object carved itself. When the forensic team ran tests on the markings, expecting to find a known language or symbolic system, the results were inconclusive. The symbols did not match any known alphabet, ancient or modern. They didn't resemble runes, tribal etchings, esoteric sigils, or coded shorthand. But the strangest part was that under UV light, the carvings shifted slightly, as though they were not stable, as though the meaning was fluid. Detective Hale leaned forward, rubbing his temples. "Families don't get cursed," he muttered. "Families get targeted. By people. With motives." But even he knew the words sounded hollow. The team began mapping each death on a board. For generations, for tragedies spaced decades apart. But when one analyst plotted the exact dates, something clicked that no one had noticed before. Every death occurred within the same 7-day period in late autumn, regardless of year, location, lifestyle, or age. A statistical impossibility. Either someone had orchestrated these deaths with near-perfect precision across a century, or something else was at play. Behavioral psychologist Dr. Reyes suggested generational trauma. Sometimes, she said softly, families internalize tragedy so deeply it rewrites their psychological structure. Stress, fear, hallucinations, these things can be inherited. But even she admitted trauma didn't explain Andrew's two bodies, or the inexplicable symbols, or Daniel's final message typed into his shattered phone. The team dug deeper. They examined DNA from all 4 deceased Harringtons. Standard markers showed normal inheritance patterns, but there was one anomaly, a fragment found in each generation that geneticists labeled unclassified. It wasn't harmful. It wasn't a mutation. It simply didn't match normal genetic coding. It also didn't match anyone outside the Harrington line. Detectives were told politely that it was an ancestral irregularity of no concern, but Hale felt the hairs on his neck rise. Something was being overlooked. When they compared medical records, the pattern grew even darker. Eleanor had complained of night voices. Andrew had been seen talking to someone who wasn't there. Michael drew spirals and shadow figures in his journals. Robert heard whispers on the lake. Daniel felt watched in his own home. Different symptoms, different lifetimes, but the same sense of being observed. One forensic chart highlighted another disturbing detail: pupil dilation. Eleanor's pupils were described as unusually expanded. Michael's were blown wide open. Daniel's were fixed and dilated. These were not symptoms of fear alone. They were symptoms of neurochemical disruption, like a sudden surge of adrenaline triggered by a perceived threat. But in every case, no intruder had been found. A breakthrough came unexpectedly when a tech analyst retrieved Daniel's home security logs. The cameras recorded nothing unusual, until they reviewed footage frame by frame. In the living room camera feed, at precisely 2:08 a.m. on the night of his death, one frame flickered. Just a single frame. For less than a tenth of a second, the camera caught a shape, a tall, slender silhouette standing at the base of the stairs, unmoving. The shape had no face, no identifiable features, and no solidity. It looked like a shadow cast by something that wasn't there. Then it vanished. The next frame showed nothing. The room went silent as investigators replayed the clip. Dr. Reyes whispered, "That looks like the same thing described in Andrew's file." She was right. The witness who found Andrew's body near the roadside claimed she saw a tall shadow standing behind him. Reports from the 1964 neighbors mentioned a figure leaving the Harrington house after Michael died. Even Robert's childhood friend described seeing a dark watcher at the lake. For the first time, the investigators considered the unthinkable. Perhaps the figure wasn't a hallucination or a misinterpretation. Perhaps it was real. A presence observed across eras, across locations, across generations. A presence that never aged, never changed. Detective Hale refused to believe in the supernatural. He demanded physical explanations. But the case refused to behave like a physical mystery. He ordered a deeper forensic sweep of Daniel's home, focusing on the symbol discovered on the bedroom wall under UV light. They soon made a discovery that chilled even the seasoned officers: microscopic skin cells embedded in the wall paint. Not human. Not animal. Unknown biological origin, the lab reported. The cells had unusual structures, as if they were shedding from something that did not belong in any known category of life. As the investigators tried to process this, a call came in from a local historian who had been reviewing old municipal archives. She had found references to the Harrington family dating back even further, strange incidents in the 1800s involving people with the same surname and similar deaths. But the historian emphasized one detail that shook the room: these earlier Harringtons were not genetically related to Thomas Harrington at all. They were part of a separate branch, long erased from town records. This revelation suggested that the pattern was not confined to one family line. It was tied to the name itself, or something associated with certain individuals long before the documented curse began. Detective Hale closed his notebook slowly. "So this isn't a family curse," he said. "It's something else." Something choosing them. The genealogist nodded grimly. And it's still choosing. Before anyone could respond, a forensic assistant rushed into the room with urgent news. Fingerprints had been found on the wooden carving. Not matching Daniel. Not matching any Harrington. Not matching anyone in national databases. But the most disturbing part was the temperature of the carving. Even after hours in the evidence locker, it was cold, unnaturally cold, just like the lungs of the first Andrew body. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. The investigators realized they were no longer dealing with a case. They were dealing with a presence. One that became active under specific circumstances, at specific times, under a pattern too precise to be random or human-made. As they prepared their next steps, the genealogist hesitated, then asked the question everyone else was too afraid to voice: what if it's not haunting them? What if it's hunting them? The question lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating, as though the room itself was listening. And somewhere, just beyond the reach of the visible world, something seemed to shift. The deeper the investigators dug into the Harrington mystery, the more they realized that believing in a supernatural explanation was the easy route, almost comforting in its own terrifying way. Accepting that something inhuman was stalking the family meant believing there was nothing anyone could have done to stop it. But if a person was responsible, that was far worse. Humans could be cruel, strategic, patient, and relentless. A human could plan across continents, manipulate generations, erase evidence, and stay hidden in plain sight. A human could do damage not bound by rules or legends. And so, reluctantly, the investigative team began looking at suspects, real people with motives, grudges, obsessions, or dark histories that could tie them to the Harringtons across time. The list was shorter than they expected, but each name carried a heaviness none of them wanted to acknowledge. The first suspect was a man whose presence in the Harrington story was barely documented, a shadow in the founding tragedy, the unknown man seen with Eleanor on the night Thomas returned home in 1911. He had vanished without a trace, never identified, never questioned. His footsteps, metaphorically and literally, seemed wiped from the earth. But the genealogist discovered something alarming. 3 births recorded in nearby towns over the next 8 years listed the father as unknown, and the mother as women who had lived near Eleanor before her death. All 3 children displayed unusual symptoms: sleepwalking, murmured whispers, drawings of figures with no faces. Every one of those children later disappeared as adults. No remains. No records. Erased. Investigators wondered, what if the man Eleanor had been with wasn't a lover, but something else? A manipulator? An observer? A catalyst? Someone, or something, that set the curse into motion by anchoring itself to the Harrington bloodline through contact with Eleanor? But the case demanded human suspects, not entities, so the team moved on. The second suspect was Arthur Kellerman, a local coroner from the 1930s to the 1950s who had personally examined both Andrew's bodies. His notes were unprofessional, rambling in places, often contradicting themselves. Some lines sounded almost frightened, as if he saw something he refused to document. The genealogist uncovered that Arthur had visited the Harrington house multiple times after Eleanor's death, claiming he was checking on the family's mental well-being. Yet neighbors insisted he had been obsessed with Eleanor, visiting her grave weekly long after she was buried. Some whispered that Arthur believed Eleanor was still speaking to him, guiding him to protect the family from a threat only he understood. His descendants refused to discuss him, and half of his journals were burned by his own son after Arthur's institutionalization in 1959. The remaining journals mentioned a recurring dream, a tall figure standing beside his bed, whispering instructions he could never remember upon waking. Detective Hale wondered whether Arthur had obsessively inserted himself into the Harrington tragedies, perhaps even orchestrating them under delusion. But Arthur died decades before Michael and Robert. That theory didn't hold. The third set of suspects expanded into something more troubling, a secretive branch of the Harrington family tree, people who shared the surname but not the direct bloodline. These were individuals born from distant cousins or illegitimate relations, many of whom lived in an isolated community just outside town limits. Old census data showed their numbers decreasing sharply every few decades, with no explanations for the disappearances. When the investigative team visited the now abandoned community, they discovered symbols carved into tree trunks, matching the carvings found on the wooden figure. Inside a collapsed cabin, they found children's drawings, stick figures, lakes, trees, and a tall, faceless figure always watching from a corner of the page. The drawings dated back to the 1920s. Detective Hale asked aloud, what if someone from this branch believed in the curse so deeply they took it upon themselves to keep the pattern alive? The idea chilled the room. A person embracing the legend, turning it into ritual, reenacting it across generations, this was a very human, very horrifying possibility. But there were holes in this theory too. Many individuals from that branch had no documented contact with the four primary Harrington generations. And yet, they suffered similar fates. So, who was hunting who? The fourth suspect was a man named Caleb Wren, a historian who had lived in town for more than 40 years. Caleb had spent his life writing about disappearances, local folklore, and unexplained tragedies. He had moved into the old Kellerman property in the 1980s, turning the coroner's dusty office into his personal archive. Caleb was charming, reclusive, and uncomfortably knowledgeable about the Harrington story. He admitted he had once tried interviewing Robert Harrington, who refused to talk out of fear. Caleb had been seen at the lake hours before Robert's death, walking alone, staring into the water as if waiting for something to rise. When questioned, Caleb seemed amused more than defensive. He claimed he was documenting the curse objectively, but his eyes glimmered with a strange excitement whenever investigators mentioned the wooden carving. They searched his home, old books, old letters, old newspaper clippings, but nothing directly implicated him. Yet the genealogist whispered to Hale, he knows more than he says. Suspicion lingered. But the most unnerving suspect wasn't one person. It was a lineage. The investigators discovered a specific surname that intersected with the Harringtons multiple times over the generations, sometimes through marriage, sometimes through proximity, sometimes through land disputes. This family, the Morrow clan, had a history nearly as troubling as the Harringtons. Records showed mysterious deaths, unexplained disappearances, and recurring symbols carved into the wood beams of their old barns. A chilling connection emerged. The unknown man Eleanor was seen with belonged to the Morrow family. He had lived in a neighboring county, worked as a surveyor, and disappeared a week after Eleanor's death. His personal journals, uncovered by the genealogist, contained drawings of the same faceless figure, and detailed notes about Eleanor's unique presence, her unbroken lineage, and the phrase, marked by blood and shadow. Why was he obsessed with Eleanor? What did he mean by unbroken lineage? Was he stalking her? Studying her? Using her? Or was he running from the same thing that later consumed the Harringtons? Detective Hale attempted to interview surviving Morrows, but most refused to talk. One elderly member of the family finally agreed, her voice shaking as she spoke. She said her grandmother had warned her never to marry a Harrington, never to step foot in their home, never to speak their names aloud in the dark. When Hale asked why, the woman answered, because something watches them. Something follows them. And anyone close to them becomes visible to it. The investigative team was left with a terrifying possibility: the Harringtons weren't the only ones haunted, they were the ones chosen. A chilling silence fell across the room as Hale circled one name with a red marker, a person tied to the Morrow lineage, present in town during Eleanor's time, seen near the lake during Andrew's final night, and quietly living within miles of both Michael and Robert during their deaths. A man who had no alibis. A man erased from public records. A man who somehow appeared in photographs from different decades without aging. His face was expressionless in every photograph, eyes dark, posture identical. A forensic analyst whispered, "This isn't possible." But the genealogist, pale and trembling, said softly, "It's not a man. It's a role. Passed down. Or carried on. The figure changes bodies, or doesn't need one. Hale felt his chest tighten. Was this the orchestrator of the curse? A guardian? A predator? A witness? Before they could dig further, an assistant burst into the room with a new piece of evidence, a hidden photograph found in Daniel's home. A photo taken decades earlier, showing a tall shadowy figure standing behind young Daniel at a family picnic. No one had noticed it before. Now, the figure's outline matched perfectly with the camera glitch from Daniel's final night. Someone's alibi had just collapsed. And the curse, whether human or not, had just taken form. The Harrington family home had stood for more than a century, weathering storms, deaths, disappearances, and generational grief. But no one had ever touched the attic. Not really. It was a space the family avoided instinctively, a place spoken about in hushed tones, a room that felt older than the house itself. When Daniel inherited the property after his father's death, he rarely entered it. And when investigators arrived after Daniel's body was discovered, they found the attic door nailed shut from the outside, as though someone wanted to keep something in, not out. Detective Hale ordered the door carefully removed. The wood splintered with a long, groaning crack that echoed through the empty hallways. The moment the door opened, a thick wave of cold air drifted down, colder than the rest of the house, colder than December outside. The officers exchanged tense looks. Hale climbed first, flashlight in hand, the beam slicing through dust that hung in the air like suspended memories. The attic was massive, larger than expected. Boxes lined the walls, each unmarked, each covered in decades of dust. But what drew Hale's attention immediately was the arrangement at the center of the attic, a circle of old furniture, positioned deliberately, almost ritualistically. In the middle of the circle lay a pile of journals, letters, and loose papers, scattered as if someone had rifled through them recently. The dust around them was disturbed. Someone had been in the attic that night. As Hale stepped forward, the floorboards moaned beneath him. His flashlight illuminated the wall directly ahead, and he froze. Dozens of symbols identical to those on the wooden carving had been drawn on the wooden beams. They were layered, overlapping, scratched with different intensities, suggesting they'd been redrawn over and over across years. Some were fresh, the wood lighter, newly exposed. Others were ancient, their edges softened by time. It wasn't random vandalism. It was documentation. Or obsession. Or warning. The journals revealed even more. The first stack belonged to Eleanor, written in loops of elegant cursive. Her entries began normally, reflections on her daily life, the farm, her son Andrew. But as Hale flipped deeper, her handwriting trembled. She described hearing footsteps in the attic at night. Described voices leaking through the floorboards. Described waking to the sensation of someone standing over her. She wrote that Thomas, her husband, refused to believe her. She wrote that something in the attic wanted attention. Her final entry read, "It watches from above. It waits for darkness. The shadow is patient." The second stack belonged to Andrew. His journals were less coherent, filled with sketches instead of sentences. Spirals, silhouettes, long black figures with no faces, standing at the foot of his bed. One page depicted the lake, with a dark shape emerging from the water. Another showed the attic door with the words, "Don't open it." Detective Hale felt a chill crawl up his spine as he turned the pages. Andrew had drawn the wooden carving dozens of times, from different angles, with more detail than any other member of the family. Some drawings depicted it floating. Others showed it burning but remaining intact. One particularly disturbing sketch showed a hand, Andrew's own hand, reaching toward the carving as though being pulled by it. But the most haunting part wasn't the drawings. It was the repetition of the same phrase his grandmother had written, "It always comes at night." Michael's journals were there too, tucked beneath a box labeled "Tools." His handwriting was frantic, uneven. He described being woken by tapping sounds, by scratching inside the walls, by the weight of something sitting on the edge of his bed. He described hearing water dripping in the attic even though there were no pipes. He wrote about dreams where Andrew called to him from the lake, where Eleanor begged him to run, where the attic seemed to breathe. Michael wrote about the night he first heard the footsteps above him. He wrote about whispering voices saying his name. He wrote about finding the attic door slightly open when he knew he had locked it. And in the final journal, just days before his death, he wrote, "It's here again. It found me. I can feel it learning me." The last handwriting was Daniel's, sharper and more modern, written with a meticulousness that spoke of desperation. His entries were the most structured. He had researched everything. Every death in the family. Every symbol. Every record. He had copied autopsy notes, drawn diagrams, even plotted dates and locations. But what unsettled Hale most were the parts where Daniel wrote about the attic while still alive. He wrote that he heard footsteps pacing overhead every night at exactly 3:12 a.m. He wrote that sometimes the footsteps stopped directly above his bed. He wrote that he tried recording the sounds, but the recordings always went silent at 3:12. Daniel wrote that he saw shadow movement under the attic door. He wrote that cold air seeped downward whenever he approached it. And in one entry, nearly torn through by the force of his pen, he wrote, "It opened the door last night. Not by mistake. It wanted me to know it could." Detective Hale swallowed hard as he read the final pages. Daniel's last entry, written less than 24 hours before his death, was barely legible. The carving moved. "I didn't touch it. It faces the attic now. It wants me upstairs. If I go, I don't come back." The officers continued searching the attic, stepping carefully around the symbols and journals. Then Officer Reed called Hale over. His flashlight pointed at something half hidden behind a crate, a wooden box, small and carved with the same strange designs. Hale opened it slowly. Inside was a collection of letters, unsent, unfinished, most written by the generations of Harrington men. Apologies. Confessions. Pleas for help. Declarations that they felt watched. One letter, unsigned, contained only a single line: "The attic is not a place. It is a door." Reed swallowed. "A door to what?" he whispered. Hale didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the far corner of the attic, where the dust was disturbed, fresh footprints, bare, small, like those found in Daniel's home. But these footprints didn't lead to the attic steps. They ended at the wall. The wall marked with the symbol Daniel had drawn under UV light in his bedroom. The same one carved into the wooden figurine. The same one sketched by Eleanor, Andrew, Michael, and Robert. Hale pressed his hand near the symbol. The wood was icy cold, colder than winter air should allow. The cold pulsed, rhythmic, almost like breathing. And then the attic lamp flickered. Just once. But enough for Hale to see it, a tall, dark silhouette reflected in the dusty attic window behind him. Motionless. Faceless. Watching. When he spun around, the shape was gone. But the footprints in the dust had multiplied. They circled him. He stepped back, heart pounding, knowing what the journals had tried to warn them: the attic wasn't haunted. It was inhabited. And whatever lived there had been waiting, patiently, for each generation to return. The genealogist returned the next morning with an expression that made Detective Hale brace himself. She placed a thin folder on the table, much smaller than the others, yet somehow heavier with implication. Inside was a list of names, dates, and death records that didn't belong to the Harringtons, at least not officially. These were people from entirely different families, spread across different towns, different states, different eras. And yet their deaths mirrored the Harrington pattern exactly: same week of the year, same unnatural circumstances, same unexplained presence reported by witnesses. The twist was devastating in its simplicity: the Harringtons were not unique. They were part of a pattern far older and far wider than their bloodline. The genealogist discovered that each victim, no matter their surname, shared one hidden connection. Each was descended from a forgotten branch of the same ancestral line dating back to the 1700s. A line marked in old records with a single word, chosen. What the family believed was a personal curse was actually generational selection, an unseen force following not a name, but a lineage scattered across centuries. And as Hale scanned the list, his stomach dropped. One of the descendants was still alive. A young woman living only 2 towns away. And she had gone missing the night before. Detective Hale had investigated homicides for 22 years, but he had never seen a case converge the way the Harrington file now did. Every lead pointed toward something impossible, something older than the family, older than the town, older than any written record. But the missing descendant, the young woman connected through the hidden ancestral line, changed everything. If she was alive, she might be the first living witness to whatever had stalked the Harringtons for generations. If she was dead, the pattern had already begun again. Her name was Mara Benson, 27 years old. She lived alone in a small rental house near an abandoned orchard. When detectives arrived, the front door was locked from the inside. Her car still sat in the driveway. Lights off. Curtains drawn. It looked like she hadn't left in days. Hale forced the door open. The air inside felt heavy, suffocating, not rotting, not stale, just dense, like something unseen pressed against the walls. Mara wasn't there. The living room was spotless, but not in an ordinary way, more like someone had prepared the space intentionally. Furniture centered. Blankets folded. A single glass of water placed perfectly on the table, untouched. Hale's flashlight traveled along the walls until it stopped on something that tightened his breath, symbols. Dozens of them. The same symbols found in the Harrington attic, carved lightly into the paint, following the curve of the room like a warning or a ritual. Then Hale spotted something on the floor, a footprint. Small, bare, identical to the one found in Daniel's house. It pointed toward the hallway. He followed cautiously. Inside Mara's bedroom, her journal lay open on the bed. The last entry was hurried, jagged, "I've seen it outside. It doesn't knock. It waits. It wants me to be alone." Below the writing, a shaky line seemed to drag off the page, as if the pen was pulled from her hand mid-stroke. Hale's radio crackled. The forensic tech downstairs sounded panicked. "Detective, you need to see this basement." The stairs creaked as Hale descended. The air grew colder the farther he went. His flashlight caught dust floating, disturbed by something recent. And then he saw Mara. She was kneeling in the center of the basement floor, facing the concrete wall. Her posture was perfectly still, eerily familiar, hands resting on her thighs, head tilted slightly downward. Exactly like Eleanor. Exactly like Michael. Exactly like Daniel. For a moment Hale believed she was alive, frozen in fear. But when he touched her shoulder, her body tilted unnaturally, stiff and cold. No wounds. No struggle. No logical cause of death. And there, placed gently beside her hand, was the carving. Its symbols glowed faintly under Hale's flashlight, as though reacting to the chill. The forensics team moved around carefully, documenting everything, but Hale's eyes stayed on the wall Mara had been facing. Something was etched there, deep grooves, carved with more force than human strength. The symbol was larger, more intricate, almost pulsating in the dim light. As the detectives approached, the basement bulb flickered violently. Then Hale saw it, a long, vertical crack running down the wall from ceiling to floor. Not natural. Not structural. The edges were rounded, as if worn smooth from movement. Mara had written that the thing didn't knock. It didn't need to. This wasn't just a symbol. This was an opening. Or something trying to open. And suddenly everything snapped into place. The deaths weren't executions, they were positioning. Each generation unknowingly reenacted the same ritual posture, the same placement of the carving, the same date. They weren't victims of a random curse. They were part of a cycle. A call and response across centuries. And Daniel's death, the fresh symbol in his attic, the footprint that didn't belong to him, the carved object facing upward, wasn't a haunting. It was the final step. The crack in Mara's basement wall widened with a soft, brittle sound, like old stone breathing. Hale stumbled back. His chest pounding. His throat dry. Because the truth was horrifying in its clarity, the curse wasn't returning. It wasn't repeating. It was building. And with Mara's death, the cycle was complete. Something had finally answered the call. Something was coming through.